Top 1. The Sea Peoples. In 1177 BCE, along the fortified shores of the Nile Delta, Egyptian scribes recorded a crisis unlike any they had seen before. Under the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, inscriptions carved into the walls of Medinet Habu described a coalition of foreign warriors arriving by land and sea. They came with ox-drawn carts, women, children, and entire communities in tow. They were not raiders. They were moving civilizations. Egyptian reliefs show ships colliding in violent naval battles, bodies falling into the water, and shields raised beneath a sky carved in stone. The records name them collectively as the Sea Peoples. And then, almost as suddenly as they appear, they disappear. The Egyptian accounts portray them as a force capable of toppling entire kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological layers from Anatolia to the Levant show widespread destruction dated to the same narrow window of time. Cities burned, trade routes collapsed, bronze supply chains fractured. The late Bronze Age system, once interconnected and stable, unraveled within decades. Yet the very coalition blamed for this collapse left behind no identifiable homeland, no enduring capital, and no unified language. Excavations in coastal Canaan reveal material culture shifts that some scholars attribute to migrating Sea Peoples groups. Pottery styles change abruptly. Burial customs alter. Fortification patterns shift. Yet these traces are fragmented and inconsistent. No inscription from the so-called invaders themselves has ever been recovered. No royal archive. No centralized command structure. Only references written by those who fought them. Egyptian records claim a decisive victory. The reliefs show captured enemies, bound and humiliated. But if the Sea Peoples were truly defeated, where did the survivors go? There is no mass grave corresponding to a destroyed superarmy. No evidence of systematic extermination. Instead, small pockets of cultural transformation ripple outward across the region. Some historians propose assimilation into emerging Iron Age societies. Others suggest internal fragmentation. Yet no model fully accounts for the scale of their earlier coordinated movement. The most unsettling detail lies in timing. The Sea Peoples appear precisely at the moment when multiple advanced civilizations were already strained by climate shifts, famine, and internal unrest. They did not merely invade a stable world, they struck at a system already weakening. Whether they were the cause of collapse or a symptom of it remains debated, but their disappearance is harder to explain than their arrival. Within a few generations, the name fades. Egyptian inscriptions stop mentioning them. Assyrian records do not track a continuous Sea Peoples identity. What remains are scattered theories and a handful of burned cities dated to the same era. A confederation strong enough to challenge Egypt should have left a legacy. Instead, it left silence. If the Sea Peoples were a displaced population fleeing something larger, what drove them across the Mediterranean in the first place? If they were conquerors, why did they not consolidate power? And if they were absorbed into new cultures, why does no surviving group preserve a clear memory of that origin? An entire moving civilization appears in the historical record, with force, reshapes the geopolitical map of the ancient world, and then dissolves into anonymity. The late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most studied turning points in antiquity. Yet the identity of the Sea Peoples remains unresolved. A force powerful enough to fracture empires should have built one of its own. Instead, it left behind a question that still stands carved in stone. Top 2. The Minoans. In 1450 BCE, across the island of Crete, palace complexes that had stood for centuries fell silent. At Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, administrative centers once alive with trade, ritual, and maritime coordination were abruptly abandoned or destroyed. Storage magazines filled with clay tablets lay cracked beneath collapsed ceilings. Frescoes depicting dolphins and ceremonial processions were buried under layers of ash and rubble. The civilization known today as the Minoans, masters of Bronze Age seafaring, did not vanish in a single cataclysmic explosion. They faded in stages, and then their voice disappeared entirely. For centuries before their decline, the Minoans dominated Aegean trade networks. Their ships moved copper, tin, saffron, textiles, and crafted goods across the Mediterranean. Their cities lacked defensive walls, suggesting either extraordinary naval confidence or a world in relative balance. Their script, Linear A, recorded economic transactions and religious offerings. It remains undeciphered. Whatever language they spoke has not survived translation. The first destabilizing event often cited is the eruption of Thera, a volcanic explosion that sent ash plumes thousands of feet into the atmosphere and triggered tsunamis that battered northern Crete. Yet archaeological evidence shows that Minoan society recovered after the eruption. Palaces were rebuilt, trade resumed. The final blow came later. By 1400 BCE, Linear B tablets appear in Crete, written in an early form of Greek associated with the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. Administrative structures shift. Burial practices change. Artistic styles harden. The fluid marine motifs of Minoan art give way to more rigid, militaristic imagery. It is clear that mainland influence intensified. What remains unclear is how. There is limited evidence of widespread battlefield carnage. No mass graves marking a decisive invasion. No centralized record of conquest. Instead, a pattern of controlled takeover emerges. Key palace sites show destruction, followed by reoccupation under new administrative systems. It suggests infiltration, elite replacement, or internal power struggles exploited by external forces. The most haunting element is linguistic disappearance. Linear A vanishes completely. Unlike Linear B, which scholars eventually deciphered, Linear A has resisted every attempt at translation. Without understanding the script, the inner worldview of the Minoans remains sealed. Their religious practices, political organization, and self-identity are filtered through later interpretations. They become a shadow civilization reconstructed from pottery shards and fresco fragments. Genetic studies suggest continuity among Cretan populations, implying that the people did not vanish biologically. What dissolved was cultural autonomy. The transition from Minoan to Mycenaean Crete appears swift within the archaeological record. A maritime network that once defined the island's identity is replaced by integration into a mainland power system. Some researchers propose that the Minoans were weakened economically before Mycenaean dominance took hold. Others suggest internal fragmentation between regional elites. Yet the absence of explicit transitional documentation leaves room for speculation. A civilization advanced in architecture, trade logistics, and artistic expression did not collapse into primitive obscurity. It was overwritten. When the Mycenaean world itself collapsed a few centuries later, Crete entered another phase of instability. By then, the original Minoan voice had already been erased. Their myths survive indirectly in later Greek legend, reframed through stories of labyrinths and monstrous kings. But legend is not language. Myth is not record. If the Minoans were absorbed rather than annihilated, why does no clear hybrid identity persist in early Greek accounts? Why does Linear A not evolve gradually into another script? Cultural transitions typically leave footprints. In Crete, the footprints are faint. A civilization that mastered the sea, built multi-story palaces without fortifications, and coordinated complex trade systems did not end in fire alone. It ended in silence. Top 3. The Hattans. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, long before the Hittite Empire carved its name into the stone records of Anatolia, the land was known as Hatti. It was not a title imposed from outside. It was the name of the people who lived there. The Hattians occupied central Anatolia, building fortified settlements across rolling plateaus and river valleys. They left behind temples, ritual objects, and fragments of a language that would later survive only in borrowed form. And then, within a few generations of contact with an incoming Indo-European power, their identity dissolved. By 1650 BCE, Hittite rulers had established dominance over much of the region. Yet in early Hittite texts, the term land of Hatti continued to be used. This detail is often overlooked. The conquerors adopted the geographic name of the conquered. They inherited sacred sites, deities, and ceremonial traditions. But they did not preserve the language. Hattian speech survived only in ritual contexts, embedded within Hittite religious texts, like fossilized remnants of an older world. The Hattian language itself remains poorly understood. It was not Indo-European. It does not align cleanly with neighboring linguistic families. Most of what is known comes from Hittite transcriptions of ceremonial chants and invocations. There are no extensive Hadean archives. No royal inscriptions written in their own script have been discovered. If such archives existed, they did not survive the transition of power. Archaeological layers show continuity in settlement patterns. There is no sweeping evidence of mass slaughter. Fortifications were not uniformly destroyed. Instead, administrative control shifted. Elite authority changed hands. Religious centers were repurposed. It appears less like annihilation and more like absorption. Yet the speed at which Hadean linguistic identity vanished is striking. In many historical transitions, conquered populations retain elements of their language for centuries. Loanwords persist, dialects blend. But in Anatolia, Hadean speech receded into liturgical use and then into obscurity. By the height of Hittite imperial power, the Hadeans existed more as a memory than as a people. Some scholars suggest that the Hittites integrated Hadean elites into their political structure. Others propose demographic imbalance, with Indo-European populations gradually becoming dominant through migration. But the archaeological record offers no clear demographic break large enough to explain complete cultural replacement. The genetic continuity of Anatolian populations across millennia complicates the narrative of simple displacement. What makes the disappearance unsettling is not violence, but erasure. The Hittites preserved Hadean gods, ritual formulas, and sacred geography. They acknowledged a past, yet they did not preserve the independent voice of the people who first named the land. When the Hittite Empire later collapsed during the wider Late Bronze Age crisis, successor states emerged across Anatolia and Syria, but none identified themselves as Hadean. The name remained attached to the territory, not to a living culture. If the Hadeans were assimilated peacefully, why does their language not echo more strongly in subsequent Anatolian dialects? If they resisted, where are the defensive layers marking prolonged conflict? The evidence suggests neither complete destruction nor seamless integration. It suggests a controlled transition in which political dominance quietly rewrote identity. The land kept its ancient name. The people who gave it that name faded behind the script of those who replaced them. Top 4. The Philistines. In 604 BCE, Babylonian forces under King Nebuchadnezzar II swept through the southern Levant. Cities that had stood for centuries fell one by one. Among them were Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, the 5 city-states historically associated with a people known as the Philistines. Within decades of this campaign, references to the Philistines as a distinct ethnic and political group vanish from Near Eastern records. They do not reappear. For centuries prior, the Philistines had been a formidable presence along the Mediterranean coast. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe battles against a group called the Peliset, widely associated with the Philistines. Archaeological layers from the 12th century BCE reveal new pottery styles, architectural changes, and dietary patterns in the coastal Levant. Pig consumption increases. Aegean-style ceramics appear. The evidence suggests a migrating population with connections to the wider Mediterranean world. The Philistines built fortified cities, developed ironworking expertise, and engaged in sustained conflict with neighboring Israelite kingdoms. Their presence is documented not only in biblical texts, but in Assyrian administrative records. They paid tribute. They negotiated alliances. They resisted imperial expansion when possible. They were not a minor tribe. They were a regional power. Then the pattern shifts. By the late 7th century BCE, Babylonian campaigns targeted the Levantine corridor to secure trade routes and suppress Egyptian influence. Excavations at Ashkelon show a destruction layer dated precisely to Nebuchadnezzar's invasion. Burned storehouses, collapsed walls, arrowheads embedded in debris. Yet even here, the material record does not point to wholesale extermination. The cities were repopulated. Trade resumed under Babylonian oversight. What disappears is not the population, but the name. Assyrian and Babylonian records begin referring to the region in administrative terms rather than ethnic ones. The identity Philistine ceases to function as a political category. Later Persian records make no mention of a surviving Philistine entity. Unlike other subdued groups who retain local governance structures under imperial rule, the Philistines dissolve into the provincial framework. Linguistically, the Philistine language is elusive. Early inscriptions are sparse and fragmentary. Over time, local inscriptions shift toward dominant regional languages. Cultural markers that once distinguished Philistine settlements from neighboring groups blur within 2 centuries of sustained imperial contact. Genetic analyses from excavated remains suggest some Aegean ancestry in early Philistine populations. But later samples show increasing local integration. The distinct genetic signature becomes diluted. The material culture that once defined their coastal cities blends into broader Levantine norms. The Babylonian conquest did not erase the coastline, it erased a label. Unlike the Israelites, whose identity persisted in exile narratives, or the Phoenicians, who maintained maritime networks under shifting imperial powers, the Philistines leave no surviving textual tradition from their own perspective. Their story survives primarily through the records of their rivals and conquerors. If the Philistines were fully destroyed, the archaeological continuity would be broken. It is not. If they were fully absorbed, we would expect clearer traces of cultural synthesis. Instead, the record shows gradual flattening, administrative integration, linguistic assimilation, identity compression under empire. A people who once stood as a coastal power in the Eastern Mediterranean did not vanish in a single massacre. They faded through bureaucratic absorption and imperial restructuring. When the name Philistine disappears from the record, it does not coincide with empty cities. It coincides with reclassified ones. A civilization can survive conquest. It can survive exile. But can it survive the quiet removal of its own name? Top 5. The Nabateans. In 106 CE, the Roman Empire annexed the kingdom of Nabatea without recording a decisive battle. No grand siege is described in surviving Roman accounts. No dramatic last stand marks the fall of Petra, the Nabatean capital carved directly into rose-colored sandstone cliffs. Instead, the transition appears administrative. Arabia Petraea became a Roman province. A new governor was installed. Imperial inscriptions replaced local authority. And within a few generations, the Nabateans as a distinct people disappear from the historical record. For nearly 4 centuries before annexation, the Nabateans controlled the desert trade routes linking southern Arabia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. They managed the flow of frankincense, myrrh, spices, and textiles. Their wealth funded monumental architecture carved with precision into sheer rock faces. They engineered complex water management systems capable of sustaining urban life in an arid environment receiving less than 6 inches of annual rainfall. Cisterns, dams, and channels turned desert into controlled infrastructure. Their script, derived from Aramaic, would later influence the development of Arabic writing. Inscriptions reveal royal lineages and dedications to deities such as Dushara and Al-Uzza. The Nabateans were not an isolated tribe. They were a literate, economically strategic kingdom positioned between empires. When Rome expanded eastward under Emperor Trajan, Nabatea was surrounded. Yet the annexation is described as peaceful. Archaeological layers in Petra do not show widespread burning. Urban continuity persists. Roman-style buildings appear alongside existing structures. Coins bearing imperial faces circulate through the city. What vanishes is sovereignty. Within decades, Nabatean inscriptions decline sharply. Latin and Greek administrative texts dominate official communication. Religious practices adapt. Local deities merge with Greco-Roman pantheons. Trade routes shift toward Roman-controlled infrastructure. By the 3rd century CE, Petra's prominence fades as alternative routes bypass its geographic advantage. Unlike Carthage, which was razed and rebuilt, Petra was not violently erased. It was integrated. Yet integration does not fully explain the speed of cultural dissolution. The Nabatean language does not gradually evolve into a clearly traceable successor. Instead, it fragments into regional dialects that blend into emerging Arabic linguistic patterns. Archaeological surveys of peripheral Nabatean settlements reveal abandonment without destruction. Rural sites thin out. Population density declines. Whether this was due to shifting trade economics, environmental strain, or administrative restructuring remains debated. Roman provincial policy often preserved local elites in exchange for loyalty. In some regions, indigenous identities endured for centuries under imperial oversight. In Nabatea, the transformation seems unusually complete. By late antiquity, Petra was a diminished town. By the early medieval period, it was largely forgotten by the outside world. When European explorers rediscovered Petra in the 19th century, they encountered monumental architecture without a living cultural lineage, directly claiming descent from its builders. The Bedouin tribes of the region preserved oral traditions about ancient inhabitants, but the Nabateans themselves existed only in inscriptions carved into stone. If the annexation was peaceful, why does the Nabatean identity dissolve so thoroughly? If economic decline drove abandonment, why do elite inscriptions disappear before clear evidence of demographic collapse? Cultural erasure often leaves tension points. Here the transition appears almost seamless. A kingdom that mastered desert logistics and controlled intercontinental commerce did not collapse under fire. It was absorbed, reorganized, and slowly anonymized within a larger imperial structure. Petra still stands, its facades glowing red under the sun. But the people who carved them did not leave a continuous voice behind. Top 6. The Nuragic Sardinians. Around 900 BCE, across the rugged landscapes of Sardinia, thousands of stone towers stood watch over valleys, coastlines, and inland plateaus. These structures, known today as nuraghe, were built from massive basalt blocks stacked without mortar, some rising over 60 feet high and weighing several tons each. At their peak, more than 7,000 of these towers dotted the island. They were not random monuments. They formed a network. A civilization once organized itself around them. And then within a few centuries of sustained contact with powerful Mediterranean traders, that civilization changed so completely that its original structure became almost unrecognizable. The Nuragic culture emerged in the Bronze Age, developing complex village systems clustered around central towers. Excavations reveal communal meeting huts, sacred wells aligned with celestial events, bronze figurines depicting warriors and ships, and evidence of advanced metalworking. Sardinia was rich in copper and other resources, making it strategically valuable in regional trade networks. Beginning in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Phoenician traders established coastal settlements on the island. Unlike invading armies, they arrived as merchants. Archaeological layers show imported ceramics, new architectural styles, and shifts in burial customs along coastal regions. Trade expanded. Economic integration deepened. Yet something within the interior began to fragment. By the 6th century BCE, Carthaginian influence intensified, followed later by Roman expansion. Coastal centers fell under foreign control. Inland nuragic sites show signs of gradual abandonment rather than violent destruction. The towers were not systematically demolished. Many were simply left behind. What makes the disappearance unsettling is the absence of a decisive collapse event. There is no single destruction layer marking a final conquest. Instead, the nuragic social system appears to dissolve over time. Elite bronze production declines. Ritual sites cease functioning. Settlements thin out or reorganize under new political frameworks. Genetic studies suggest population continuity on Sardinia. The people did not vanish biologically, but the cultural system built around the Nuraga towers, with its distinct iconography and social organization, does not survive intact into the Roman era. The structures remain standing across the island like silent sentinels of a society that no longer speaks. Roman records mention Sardinia primarily as a grain-producing province. They do not describe an active nuragic political identity resisting imperial control. If there was resistance, it left little written trace. If there was assimilation, it was unusually thorough. One of the most debated questions concerns the purpose of the Nurag themselves. Were they defensive fortresses, elite residences, ritual centers, or symbols of territorial control? Their distribution suggests coordinated planning across the island. Their architectural consistency implies shared engineering knowledge. Yet no written Nuragic language survives to explain them. When foreign trade networks intensified, Sardinia became part of a wider Mediterranean economy. That integration brought wealth and exchange, but it also shifted power structures toward coastal hubs aligned with external empires. Inland tower communities may have lost their economic leverage. Over time, the social logic sustaining the Nuraga network eroded. The towers still rise from the landscape, weathered but intact. They were not destroyed. They were outlived. A civilization that could mobilize labor to stack multi-ton stones into enduring monuments did not disappear in flame. It dissolved through gradual reorientation under foreign influence. The people remained. The system that defined them did not. If contact with Mediterranean superpowers brought opportunity, why did the neuralgic identity fade instead of adapting visibly? Why do the towers remain without a living tradition directly claiming their builders? Across Sardinia, the stones stand in quiet formation, as if waiting for a society that no longer gathers beneath them. Top 7. The Elamites. In 647 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launched a campaign deep into the lands east of Mesopotamia. His inscriptions describe the destruction of Susa, the Elamite capital. Temples were looted, royal tombs were opened, statues of gods were carried away. Ashurbanipal boasted that he swept Susa like a flood and turned its sacred spaces into ruins. It was a message meant to terrify neighboring powers. But even after this devastation, Elam did not vanish immediately. What followed was stranger than simple conquest. For over 1,000 years, the Elamites had existed as a political and cultural force in what is now southwestern Iran. Their kingdom interacted continuously with Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. At times they were adversaries, at times allies. They possessed their own language, unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European families, and developed a writing system that evolved from Proto-Elamite to Linear Elamite and later cuneiform adaptations. Administrative tablets, royal inscriptions, and economic records confirm a structured state apparatus. After the Assyrian destruction of Susa, the region experienced instability. Yet within decades, new Elamite rulers reappear in scattered inscriptions. The society was damaged but not erased. Then, in the 6th century BCE, another power rose. The Persians under Cyrus the Great absorbed the region into what would become the Achaemenid Empire. Unlike Assyria, Persia did not boast of annihilation. Instead, Elam became one of the core administrative centers of the empire. Susa was rebuilt and transformed into a royal residence for Persian kings. Elamite scribes were employed in imperial administration. In fact, thousands of clay tablets from Persepolis are written in the Elamite language, used as a bureaucratic medium. And yet, despite this integration into the heart of a superpower, the Elamite identity fades from historical record. After the early Achaemenid period, references to Elamites as a distinct ethnic or political entity decline sharply. Their language disappears from administrative use. It leaves no clear descendant. Unlike Akkadian, which influenced later Semitic languages, Elamite vanishes almost completely. Archaeological continuity suggests population persistence. Settlements continue under Persian rule. There is no evidence of demographic collapse comparable to earlier Assyrian devastation. Instead, what dissolves is the cultural boundary. Some scholars argue that Elamite elites merged into Persian aristocracy. Others suggest that administrative centralization under Persia rendered local identities secondary. But even under empire, many groups retained recognizable traditions. The Elamites do not. The most puzzling element is linguistic extinction. Elamite was used extensively in early Achaemenid bureaucracy. It was not a marginal dialect. It functioned at the highest levels of governance. Then over time, it disappears without leaving a traceable lineage. A language spoken and written for more than a millennium falls silent. If Elam was crushed by Assyria, it recovered. If it was absorbed by Persia, it thrived administratively. Yet by the classical period, Greek historians refer to the region in broader geographic terms, rather than as a surviving Elamite culture. A civilization that endured war, rebuilding, and imperial integration did not vanish through fire. It dissolved through incorporation into something larger. Its capital became an imperial hub. Its scribes managed records for foreign kings. Its temples were rebuilt under new patronage. But somewhere in that transformation, the Elamites stopped existing as themselves. When Susa became Persian, what happened to Elam? Top 8. The Oxus Civilization. In 1972, Soviet archaeologists excavating the deserts of present-day Turkmenistan uncovered the remains of a fortified city unlike anything expected in Central Asia. Massive mud brick walls rose from the sand, forming geometric compounds that covered more than 40 acres. Inside were columned halls, fire altars, intricate seals carved from stone, and evidence of long-distance trade. This civilization, now called the Oxus Civilization, or Bactria margiana archaeological complex, flourished around 2200 to 1700 BCE. It was urban, organized, and connected. And then, after sustained contact with surrounding powers, it dissolved without clear signs of conquest. The Oxus civilization occupied an oasis network between Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Eurasian steppe. Archaeological finds include seals resembling those of the Indus Valley, metallurgy comparable to regions westward, and luxury items such as chlorit vessels carved with mythic motifs. The cities were planned with precision. Citadels stood at their centers. Agricultural systems supported dense populations in otherwise arid landscapes. Unlike sudden collapses marked by charred layers and mass graves, Oxus sites show gradual abandonment. Defensive walls remain largely intact. There is no consistent evidence of violent destruction across major settlements. Instead, occupation thins. Some compounds are repurposed. Others are left to erosion. Around the same period, Indo-Iranian-speaking pastoral groups began moving through Central Asia. Archaeological layers indicate interaction rather than immediate warfare. New burial practices appear in the region. Certain Oxus religious symbols echo in later Indo-Iranian mythology. Some scholars propose cultural exchange, even synthesis. Others suggest demographic pressure destabilized the oasis-based urban system. Trade patterns also shifted. Mesopotamian records referencing distant lands change in frequency. The Indus Valley civilization to the south entered its own phase of decline. Climate fluctuations may have reduced water availability in marginal agricultural zones. Yet none of these factors alone fully explain the synchronized retreat of fortified Oxus centers. One of the most unsettling aspects is the absence of written records directly from the civilization. While seals and symbolic markings exist, no deciphered script provides insight into governance or self-identity. Their internal narrative is silent. Their cities stand as architectural testimony without commentary. By 1500 BCE, the once dense urban compounds were largely abandoned. Smaller settlements persisted. Nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures came to dominate the region. The monumental complexes, engineered with clear planning and resource coordination, were left behind. If invading groups overwhelmed the Oxus civilization, why do defensive structures show limited battle damage? If climate collapse drove abandonment, why do some oasis systems continue supporting habitation under later cultures? If assimilation occurred, why does the distinctive architectural pattern vanish so abruptly? The Oxus civilization sat at a crossroads of ancient exchange networks. It interacted with powerful neighbors yet maintained its own urban identity for centuries. Then, following intensified regional movements and shifting trade systems, it ceased to function as a coherent entity. The desert preserved their walls. It did not preserve their voice. A civilization capable of engineering fortified cities in hostile terrain did not end in visible catastrophe. It receded into the sand. Top 9. The Etruscans. By the 6th century BCE, central Italy was dominated by a civilization whose influence would quietly shape Rome itself. They built arched gateways before the Romans mastered them. They drained marshlands and engineered urban grids. Their nobles were buried in chamber tombs painted with scenes of banquets, music, and ritual combat. They were the Etruscans. And within a few centuries of sustained contact with a rising Roman Republic, their identity dissolved so thoroughly that even their language became a mystery. At their height, the Etruscans controlled a network of city-states stretching from Tuscany to northern Lazio. Cities like Tarquinia, Veii, and Cerveteri flourished with trade connections extending across the Mediterranean. Greek ceramics appear in their tombs. Metalwork bearing intricate designs demonstrates technical precision. They were neither isolated nor primitive. They were integrated into the wider Mediterranean world while maintaining a distinct cultural system. Their religion centered on divination and ritual interpretation of natural signs. Etruscan priests specialized in reading lightning patterns and inspecting animal livers for omens. Roman religious practice would later absorb many of these traditions. Even the Roman fasces, the bundle of rods symbolizing magisterial power, is believed to have Etruscan origins. The transformation began gradually. By the 5th century BCE, Rome was expanding. Military conflicts erupted between Rome and Etruscan cities, but these were not immediate extermination campaigns. Veii fell in 396 BCE after a prolonged siege, yet other Etruscan centers persisted. Over time, Rome absorbed territory, extended citizenship in stages, and integrated elites into its political structure. What followed was not cultural annihilation through fire. It was assimilation through administration. Latin replaced Etruscan in public inscriptions. Political authority shifted from local aristocracies to Roman magistrates. Etruscan elites adapted, intermarried, and entered Roman ranks. The most haunting remnant is the language. Thousands of inscriptions survive, carved into tomb walls, etched on bronze mirrors, and engraved on sarcophagi. Yet Etruscan remains only partially understood. It does not belong to the Indo-European family. It stands linguistically isolated. Scholars can read the letters, but struggle with the grammar and vocabulary beyond formulaic funerary phrases. Unlike Greek, which continued to thrive under Roman rule, or Hebrew, which persisted despite exile, Etruscan ceased to be spoken by the 1st century BCE. Roman writers mention it as an archaic curiosity. Within a few generations, it was no longer a living tongue. Archaeological continuity suggests that the people did not disappear. Genetic evidence points to population stability in the region. What vanished was the distinct Etruscan political and linguistic identity. Roman historians later framed early Roman kings such as Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus as Etruscan. But these narratives were filtered through Roman perspective. The irony is stark. Rome inherited Etruscan engineering, religious systems, and political symbols. Yet Rome also rewrote the narrative, positioning itself as successor rather than absorber. If the Etruscans were militarily crushed, why do many of their cities show gradual transformation rather than total destruction? If they were willingly absorbed, why did their language vanish instead of evolving into a recognizable descendant? And if their elite integrated into Roman society, why did no preserved Etruscan historical traditions survive independently? Their tombs remain intact beneath the hills of Tuscany, painted with vivid scenes of life and ceremony. Their script lines stone walls in neat, unreadable rows. A civilization that shaped Rome did not end in spectacle. It ended in quiet replacement. Rome endured. The Etruscans became a footnote beneath it. Top 10. The Indus peripheral tribes. In 1901, during the early excavations of what would later be identified as Mohenjo-Daro, British archaeologists uncovered a city planned with unsettling precision. Streets aligned on a grid. Drainage systems ran beneath stone-covered avenues. Brick dimensions followed standardized ratios across hundreds of miles. This was not a loose tribal settlement. It was a civilization. And yet, by 1900 BCE, the urban centers of the Indus Valley began to empty. Not in flames, not under siege. They were abandoned. While attention often focuses on the major cities, the most mysterious disappearances occurred in the peripheral settlements. Smaller fortified towns along trade corridors and river branches declined almost simultaneously. Excavations show thinning occupation layers, houses subdivided into cramped compartments, standardized bricks replaced by irregular local materials. Administrative seals become scarce, and then silence. The Indus script remains undeciphered. Hundreds of seals bear compact inscriptions, rarely more than 5 or 6 characters long. No bilingual key has ever been found. Without understanding the language, the internal logic of decline remains sealed. Around the same period, archaeological evidence indicates movements of Indo-Aryan-speaking pastoral groups into the northwestern subcontinent. The degree of interaction remains debated. Some layers show cultural blending, others show abandonment without clear signs of violent conquest. Climate shifts are often cited. River systems that once fed the urban core altered course. The Ghaggar-Hakra River, associated by some with the mythical Saraswati, gradually dried. Trade with Mesopotamia declined, but environmental stress alone does not fully explain the synchronized withdrawal of multiple peripheral sites. What is striking is the lack of mass graves, burn layers, or widespread weapon damage in most Indus cities. Unlike other Bronze Age collapses, there is no clear battlefield signature. Instead, populations appear to have dispersed into smaller rural communities. Urban density dissolved into village networks, yet something fundamental vanished. The standardized weights and measures disappear. Long-distance trade seals stop circulating. The script ceases entirely. It does not evolve into a traceable successor. It stops. Peripheral tribes and satellite communities would have been the first to experience stress from changing trade flows and demographic pressures. Their decline precedes or parallels the weakening of the urban core. When those outer nodes faltered, the centralized system may have lost cohesion. Genetic studies show continuity between ancient Indus populations and later South Asian groups. The people did not disappear biologically, but the civilizational structure built around cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa did not survive intact. If invading groups overran the cities, why are fortifications largely intact? If drought forced migration, why do some settlements remain habitable under later cultures? If assimilation occurred, why does the script vanish without transition? The Indus civilization did not leave behind royal victory inscriptions or catastrophic destruction layers. It left behind abandoned wells, orderly streets, and a language no one can read. A society capable of engineering multi-story brick cities, managing waste systems, and coordinating trade across hundreds of miles did not collapse in spectacle. It receded. Its people blended into future populations. Its genetic line continued. But its civilizational identity dissolved at the moment new movements reshaped the subcontinent. The cities remain as archaeological footprints. The voice that once governed them does not. These vanished tribes and civilizations reveal a pattern that is far more unsettling than open warfare. The Sea Peoples, the Minoans, the Hattaians, the Philistines, the Nabateans, the Nuragic Sardinians, the Elamites, the Oxus builders, and the Indus peripheral communities did not always fall beneath obvious catastrophe. In many cases, their populations endured. Their cities were not always burned. Their bloodlines did not vanish. What disappeared was something less visible, but far more permanent: identity. Across continents and centuries, the pattern repeats. Contact with a more centralized, militarized, or economically dominant civilization does not always produce immediate annihilation. Instead, it produces absorption, administrative restructuring, linguistic replacement, religious reinterpretation, trade dependency. The conqueror does not always erase the body, it erases the name. In nearly every case, the silence begins in the archive. Scripts go undeciphered or cease entirely. Ethnic labels vanish from imperial records. Peripheral settlements thin out before urban centers collapse. Cultural markers fragment and dissolve into broader regional norms. The physical evidence suggests continuity. The historical identity does not. This pattern challenges the traditional image of conquest as fire and sword. In these cases, collapse often occurred through integration, economic redirection, or gradual restructuring under stronger systems. The result was not empty land, but rewritten memory. If civilizations can disappear without mass graves or smoking ruins, then collapse is not always visible in stone. It can occur through bureaucracy, through language shift, through generational adaptation under foreign authority. The question is not simply why these tribes vanished, it is why their disappearance left so few transitional traces. How does a people strong enough to build towers, command trade routes, or navigate oceans lose its voice so completely within a few generations of contact? History records wars in detail. It preserves monuments of victory, but it is quieter about assimilation. And in that quiet space between conquest and continuity, entire civilizations fade without a final battle ever being fought. If these stories of lost civilizations and the erasure of history have changed the way you look at the world, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to excavating the history they tried to bury. Let us plant the seeds for a better understanding of our past. The next great treasure of knowledge will be uncovered soon.